Thanks everybody for coming, and man, you that buzzer shut everybody down quick. I didn't have to call you to attention at all. So wonderful. Hey, we're moving right along in our class on 2 Samuel. Last week, Zach was bringing us through David's family drama, part 1. This is David's family drama, part 2, but we are going to focus today on Absalom's rebellion as David's family drama there. I told Zach, I said, I really think that Absalom's rebellion needs a class of its own, and now I wish I would have said Absalom's rebellion needs 2 or 3 classes of its own, because man, there's so much stuff that we have on this, but we'll go ahead and get into it. All right. So here we are today in the red. Hopefully you enjoyed your extra hour of sleep. Next Sunday we have Mission Sunday. Then the following Sunday we'll start getting into some of David's shortcomings that we have listed for him. So I'm going to be moving through a few categories. I just want to give a brief summary, hopefully brief summary of Absalom's rebellion. We're then going to look at a little bit of the backstory of Absalom's rebellion, especially the backstory that I want to bring up, I want to call to your memory. We're also going to look at a few things that's important to keep in mind, especially contextually, how old David is, other things that are going on, and then we'll look at the battle that commences between the armies of David and Absalom here at the end. It's worth noting that a couple of early church fathers, you might say, in the 3rd and 4th century, in their writings, they liken Absalom's rebellion to the betrayal of Judas to Jesus, and there's a lot of writings there, and I think it's interesting that they some of the positions that they hold. But Absalom's rebellion was a significant thing in old Israel, and I feel like sometimes today for us it has less significance. But it's important for us to learn because a lot of things happen. So Absalom has himself declared king in Hebron. This is shortly after we're told that he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And so he's doing this by manipulating and saying, oh man, your complaint is valid. If only I were judge, then I'd give you justice. And don't bow to me. Let me come up here. Let me kiss your hand. And he's working this for a number of years. We read about that in 2 Samuel 15, 8 through 18, when he has himself declared king. Going right on to 24 through 36, David and his servants flee Jerusalem. David realizes that A, the people of Israel are with Absalom, and or maybe B, I don't want there to be a battle in this city that I love. I don't want Jerusalem to be destroyed in a conflict. So he gets out of Jerusalem for one or both of those reasons as soon as he hears that Absalom has declared himself king in Hebron. You can read about that in 24 through 36. As he is fleeing, it's interesting to see the progression of David's responses to friends and allies that he encounters as he's leaving Jerusalem. At the start, he's excited when people are joining him. And then, and he's welcoming them. And then he's telling people like Ittai the Gittite, one of his army leaders, he's telling him, why are you here? You're not an Israelite. Why don't you stay with the king? You just left your home. You don't need to come with me and hide in caves. And Ittai says, no, wherever you go, I'm going to go. And David says, okay, come on. And then he hears something else about one of his counselors joining with Absalom. And so then the next friends that he encounters, he says, you're just going to be a flat-out burden to me if you come with me. I need you to go back to Jerusalem and work for me against Absalom and against my counselor. And then also with the priests, he sends them back. He says, no, don't take the Ark of God with us. Get that back to Jerusalem. His counselor, Ahithophel, that we read, Absalom sends for and receives David's chief counselor Ahithophel. And this is one of the things that causes David pause or concern. He even says a prayer specifically recorded about Ahithophel's counsel being against him for the first time, and he wants God to be on his side. It causes David concern. And why is that? In 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 12, it says, "And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo, and the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing." So here we can read that Ahithophel was a counselor of David and also a counselor of Absalom. We go on, we can read in the mighty men list in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 34, we read about Eliphalet, the son of Ahazabai, of Maacah, but then we also read about Eliam, the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. Remember, Ahithophel the Gilonite was the one that we just referenced in the previous verse. So he was the father of one of David's mighty men, one of the 30 mighty men. Also, who else was Ahithophel? If we remember the Bathsheba narrative that we'll get into here in a few weeks, in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 3, it says, "And David sent and inquired about the woman," that is Bathsheba, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And so the daughter of Eliam, that means the granddaughter of Ahithophel. And so I can imagine this grandfather. He sees this king, whom he is the counselor for, and call and commit adultery with his granddaughter. And then he has his grandson-in-law, maybe somebody that he liked, killed. And so I can just imagine this grandfather, Ahithophel, biding his time, waiting for the opportunity that he has to turn on David, and it's no wonder that he took it. And maybe Absalom knew about this. That's why as soon as Absalom becomes king, his first thing that he does is he sends for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, that counselor of David, the one that hates David maybe because of what he had done. And so Ahithophel, his connections to David are both good and bad as well. All right, back on Absalom's rebellion. So David is lied and manipulated by Saul's servant. Saul's servant Ziba, this is the former King Saul, David tasked him with helping serve for the property of Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul's, Jonathan's son, who was crippled after Saul's death was known, and his maid or his nurse ran out with him and fell and injured Mephibosheth. And Ziba doesn't like having to serve for him. And so Ziba lies, and he's like, yeah, Mephibosheth is just excited. He's like, oh, finally, David and Absalom are going to kill each other, and I'm going to get my father's kingdom back. And David's mad, and so he says, fine, you get to take all of his property, Ziba. It's not half his and half yours anymore. It's all yours. That gets rectified later. David is fleeing, and he is going through a city of Benjamin, Bahurim. And one of Saul's descendants, Shimei, comes out to the road, and he is screaming curses at David and his men. And remember, David is not fleeing alone here. He has, we know of Abishai, we know of Joab, we know of Ittai the Gittite and his 600 soldiers that are following him. So David has this army, probably in the low thousands, that are going with him. And this man is coming out, and he's just hurling these curses and verbal abuses at this army, and he's throwing dust, and he's telling David that you are a man of blood, and now here God is returning the blood back onto your house, and he's laughing at him. Your son Absalom is seeking to kill you. You deserve it because you killed my father's house. And And remember from the mighty man lesson, one of those sons of Zeruiah, Abishai, says, just let me go cut his head off, king. There's enough of this. And David won't let him. And he says, no, maybe if I put up with this, God will find favor with me, and he won't make me actually lose the kingdom. And so David won't let him, and just kind of forces his army to hear the abuses. And it says that Shimei just continues to follow him along the hillside, throwing stones, throwing dust on him, and they have to sit there and do nothing. So then Absalom comes into Jerusalem. David has already gone, so there is no conflict or battle over Jerusalem. Absalom comes into Jerusalem, and he is initially suspicious of David's friend, the double agent that David sent back. And he said, hey, I need you to go counter Absalom's counsel. Whatever he says, I need you to advise him to do something different, because probably Ahithophel is correct. So just do something different. Tell him to do something different. Absalom is initially suspicious of David's friend, Hushai. However, eventually, he accepts Hushai's logic for why he stayed behind, and Hushai becomes one of his counselors as well. In verse 23 of chapter 16, we read that now in those days the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed by both David and Absalom. So like I said, David is here telling Hushai, just advise him to do what's ever not what Ahithophel advises. That's going to be wrong. Make him do what's wrong. And I think it's interesting, this high esteem that we're told that both David and Absalom have for Ahithophel's counsel. Because I think that we can pick a couple of things that Ahithophel recommended Absalom do that may have served their benefit, may have worked, but I think there's a couple things that he recommended that countered Absalom's pride, and so he couldn't stand it. So in chapter 17 of verse 1, Ahithophel said to Absalom, let me, this is Ahithophel, choose 12,000 men, and I, that is Ahithophel, will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I, that is Ahithophel, will strike down only the king. So he's not going to go out and kill his army. He's like, just Absalom, let me go and kill David, and then everybody, all of his mighty men, will have no choice but to serve you. And maybe this would have worked. Ahithophel here is counseling Absalom, let me do it tonight, quickly, before he crosses the Jordan, before your father, who is a mighty man and wise man of war, before he has time to choose the battlefield, before he has time to set up his lines of defense, let me just go take care of this now. And I can just see Absalom, this temporary king, whose pride and entitlement we can see in a couple of other passages that we'll look at. And he says, who did you call the king, Ahithophel? Are you saying you're going to kill King David? I'm the king, right? And so that's the first thing. But then also I think it's notable that he's saying, Absalom, don't you worry yourself about this. I'm going to go take care of it. And Absalom's here saying, no, I've been here my whole life seeing my father take all this glory. I'm going to go do it. And so that's why I underline those parts, that Ahithophel's going to do it, not Absalom. Ahithophel's going to do it, not Absalom. Ahithophel's going to do it, not Absalom. And he's going to kill the king. And I think that's the mistake that he took. And ultimately, partly why Ahithophel's counsel was not followed this one time. Hushai, the double agent that David sent back, finally sees his opportunity. Maybe he sees Absalom's blood boiling from those things that Ahithophel said, and he recommends, he's like, no, king, you know what? Ahithophel's advice was not good. So let's see here. But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you. I don't want just 12,000 men to go out and do this fly-by-night, nobody knows about it. No, you king, you great King Absalom, I want you to gather everybody from Dan to Beersheba. And remember, Hushai is trying to buy time. Dan to Beersheba is a long ways, especially if you don't have vehicles and airplanes. And so it's going to take a long time for all of Israel to be gathered to him. And he says, as the sand of the sea for a multitude. So you know what? I don't care that David's army is powerful. We're just going to swarm him like the sand of the sea. There's going to be nothing that strategy can do because you're going to have so many people. And that you go to battle. So now he's saying, you, King Absalom, are going to go take the glory for this victory against your father, King David. You go to battle in person. And that ends up being the advice that Absalom takes. It allows David and his men to get across the Jordan, and they set up their battle lines, and they choose a really difficult area, not an open field to fight in. So the wood of Ephraim, the forest in Ephraim, and that makes the numbers that Absalom has mean less. All right, so we're not going to get into the battle yet. I want to focus on the battle later. So the backstory, some of the things that I want to remind us of, focus on. After Absalom kills his brother Amnon for assaulting Absalom's sister Tamar, Absalom flees to his mom's father, his maternal grandfather, who is the king of Geshur, an Aramean city a little bit north of Israel. And so he flees there and he stays there for 3 years. And I also want you to remember that Absalom is David's third son. He kills the oldest son, Amnon, and so naturally we would think that the now crown prince is the second son. However, his first son Amnon, his second son Chileab, he is called Daniel. Chileab is called Daniel in the First Chronicles birth mention. But Chileab here in the 2 Samuel version, and then Absalom. After that birth mention in both 1 Chronicles and 2 Samuel, we never hear another mention of any kind of the second son. And so it's very possible that the second son is dead, or at least completely out of all of the royal happenings. And so he is not a potential crown prince. So probably after Amnon is dead, Absalom is the naturally viewed successor to King David. At least that's what it looks like from Absalom's actions as well as the actions of the people. After Absalom flees to Geshur, he's there for 3 years, and David spends time lamenting Absalom. He misses him, and he's not just like a little bit depressed and keeping to himself. He's mentioning this out loud enough that Joab hears about it multiple times. And Joab is like, I'm just going to solve David's problem for him. I know that he misses Absalom because he keeps saying it. But he's not going to do it if I recommend it. So I'm going to recruit this wise woman from the city of Tekoa. Joab gets this woman to come in and he says, hey, I need you to reframe the situation with the king and his estranged son. And so he manipulates with this woman, he manipulates David. He reframes the situation as this woman's son. And eventually David realizes, and he even asks her, did Joab send you? And she says yes, but it works. So David sends Joab to Geshur to bring home Absalom. We read about that in 2 Samuel 14, 1 through 20. So Absalom comes back after 3 years to Jerusalem. After he comes back, David won't see him. He says, yeah, bring him back, but he's not allowed in the palace. I don't want to see his face. You send him to his own house, and you set him up. He's going to be here in the city, but I'm not going to see him. And that's in verse 28 of chapter 14. He, that is Absalom, is angry. He's like, why didn't I just stay in Geshur? Here I am. It's been 3 years, and apparently my father hasn't forgiven me. It's now been 2 more years, so 5 years. and he's angry. So he sends for Joab, and Joab maybe recognizes that the king doesn't want to see us, so there's nothing, I'm not gonna bother you. So he sends for Joab. Joab doesn't come. And then Absalom gets angry. Remember, this prideful, arrogant, entitled son, right? So then Absalom's angry. Who does this Joab think he is, not coming to me? So he sends for him again, and Joab once again doesn't come. So man, Absalom is mad. So he turns to his servants, Absalom's servants, and he says, all right, guys, here's what we're going to do. Here's my house. Here's Joab's house. He's not coming to me. So I want you to go burn his barley field, is what he says. And he has his servants burn Joab's barley field, and that gets Joab's attention. So then Joab comes in and probably angry, but eventually that's how Absalom is able to get reconnected to the king. Joab comes in, he ends up sending him to the king. The king sends back and invites Absalom to come to him, and then he is welcomed and even kissed by the king. A couple things that I want us to keep in mind. Absalom was handsome. In chapter 14, verse 25, we read that now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. So Absalom is good looking. And he also has a good-looking father. Remember about the description of King David in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 12. It says, and he sent and brought him in. Now this is talking about David, he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Right before David gets anointed king by Samuel. So Absalom was handsome himself, had a handsome father, and then also he had a beautiful sister and a beautiful daughter. In chapter 13, verse 1, now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and after a time Amnon, David's son, loved her. And then in 14, verse 27, there were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. He named his daughter after his sister. She was a beautiful woman. Hang on. The computer froze up. All right. I'm not sure what significance it is, but I do think it's interesting that the only son of David that Scripture describes as good-looking or handsome is Absalom. The only daughter of David that Scripture describes as good-looking is Tamar, Absalom's sister. The only granddaughter of David that Scripture describes as good-looking or beautiful is Absalom's daughter, Tamar. And so I think it's interesting that these maybe, shallow or outwardly good-looking people like Absalom comes from this string, and maybe that's partly why the nation of Israel was so easy to come to him. He just looked like a prince, right? He just looked like he needs to be the next one in line. And I don't know if that's what it means, but I think it's interesting that whole line is the series of onlys that we see there. Another thing to keep in mind is that David is old. And I don't mean that he's old by default. I just mean that he's near the end of his life. So if you're older than 70, I don't want to hear grief about me calling him old. He's just near the end of his life, right? And so in 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 7, in the King James Version and also in the American Standard Version, we would see it recorded the same way. And it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow. Okay, that same verse, chapter 15 and verse 7, if we look at almost all modern translations, and I'll say almost all because I didn't read every single one, but I read a whole bunch, and every one that I saw, all of the modern translations say it this way. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, please let me go and pay my vow. So 4 or 40, which one is it? And I think it doesn't matter a whole lot which one it is, but I think it's interesting to look into a little bit. And so if we look at that word that's translated 40 or translated 4, if we're looking at the Hebrew lexicon, it's H705, and that's Abraham. It is used 136 times, and it is simply the plural version of 4. It means 40. That's all that it means. But some scholars believe that it was a copyist error, and it was supposed to say 4, not 40. But either way, it doesn't change the story, and I think the reason is simple. If the theory that says it was a copyist error is correct, then this says it's on Absalom's timeline. And so it's 4 years from when he came back to Jerusalem, or 4 years from when David started talking to him again. Either one of those, if the answer is 4. I just said that, sorry. And I want us to remember the timeline that this would be following. So Amnon assaults Tamar. Absalom waits 2 years before he takes his revenge. He then goes to Geshur for 3 years. He then comes back, but he is not able to see David for 2 years. And then after 4 years, and so that would mean, like I said, one of two things. It would be 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 2 is 11, or it'd be 2 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 again, because 2 of the 4 are included in the original 2. So then it would be 9 years. And so you have 9 years after Absalom is a man and has sired children, right? And so and we read about Absalom's birth that I mentioned earlier in chapter 3 and verse 3, that Absalom was the third born, and that was after David was already 30, and after he was king in Hebron, but during the 7.5 years before he became king over the entire nation of Israel. So somewhere between David's 30th and 37th and a half birthday, Absalom is born. And then he is grown long enough to become a man, and then he has children, and then we add either 9 or 11 years to that, to the date that we get. Or the word 40 was supposed to say 40. And it wasn't referring to Absalom's timeline, it's referring to David's timeline. And it is saying that David has reigned for 40 years. He reigned for 7.5 years in Hebron, only over the tribe of Judah. He reigned for 33 years in Jerusalem, over the whole united Israel. I didn't know, I forgot I had this slide. That's what it says here, when David reigned. So, either way, David is old. If it means 4, maybe David's like 65 instead of 70. If it means 40, David's 70. That's it. 30 plus 40 is 70. Okay, and so David is nearing the end of his life. He dies when he's like 70 and a half. So, perhaps that is partly why Absalom did this when he did. Perhaps David seemed frail and distant. Absalom believed that this was his opportunity to best his giant-killing father that was once loved by the people, but now was withdrawing from them, not interacting with the people as much. And he knew that he couldn't best him without the support of the people. He needed the masses, and so he goes out like a politician, and he's saying, no, don't, you're right. I can't believe the king's not here. If only I were judge. If only I were able to give you justice, then I would. And people love him. Back in chapter 15, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of," such and such a tribe in Israel, Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good, and write, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put his hand on his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So he knew he was going to need the popular support, so he went and got it for years after he was brought back to Jerusalem in this way. It might not have been as obscure as we read it. When we're reading through the story, it kind of seems like it just pops up out of nowhere. But as I mentioned, he was the third son, but very possibly, and maybe even probably, the next one in line after Amnon's death. And then also, I do think it's interesting. I thought I cut this out because I didn't have time, so I better not mention it. But read chapter 8, verse 18. All right. I didn't cut it out. All right, I'll make time. Okay, chapter 8, verse 18. So Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over both the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief rulers. Okay, back in the lexicon, Hebrew 35:48. Okay, so chief rulers. If you have a more modern translation, which probably most of us do, it probably reads priests instead of chief rulers. That word, H35:48, literally means one officiating. Oftentimes, when, not understandably, oftentimes in the Old Testament, the one officiating was a priest, because what it's talking about is the tabernacle or the temple of God and the sacrifices. And so the ones that were officiating those things were priests. So oftentimes it is very correctly translated priest. But we know that David's sons weren't priests because they weren't Levites. And so I think this is a good example of a time that many times it's incorrectly translated in our more modern translations. Yeah, ministers, priests, yep. It literally means one officiating. And oftentimes it's, ministers, priests, yeah. And so again, it might not have been weird that Absalom was next in line, because remember that David was a chief ruler or officer in the army before he was king. And so we read that David's sons were chief rulers or officers or officiating ones in the army while David was king. Well, remember in 2 Samuel chapter 5, this is right when David is being accepted as king over the whole nation of Israel. The reason that they give in times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you, talking to David, who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. And so David is at this time an officer in the army. And the reason that they give these several years later for why they accepted him as king is because you used to lead us anyway. Now we're going to let you lead us here. And so maybe another reason that Absalom's rise to king wasn't as obscure as sometimes we read it is because, as we read in that David's sons were leaders in the army, just like David was. So maybe it was more natural than it seems to us. All right. I think I have time for everything, all of my slides. That's good. All right. So the battle. So we're now back in chapter 18 of 2 Samuel. So David has fled Jerusalem. He's had time to cross the Jordan. He's set up the battle lines. Absalom's gathered the army from Dan to Beersheba to him, and he now has by far the advantage in numbers, and he is pursuing the armies of David. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, that is Ittai the Gittite, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people, that is all the army, heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So, right before this, David is telling his generals, his 3 generals here, that I'm going to go out to battle with you. And Joab says, no, you stay here, king. And David's like, all right, I'm not going, I had previously almost got killed by a giant. My men have told me that I'm not allowed to go out to battle with him anymore. I agreed. So he's like, all right, you got me. So he says, at least I don't want you to kill my son. And probably David's going to put a stop to it if he's out there. And maybe that's partly why Joab doesn't want him out there. So he says, instead, I'm just going to say it so the whole army can hear me. Everybody knows that I don't want Absalom to die. And so that's where he says it here. So Absalom, riding a mule, maybe being prideful, trying to show himself as a king, just like kings would ride donkeys and mules when they were confident that they wouldn't need to get away on a horse. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, that is the army of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule rode under thick branches of a great oak, and his head, probably his hair, but his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. So now he's somehow stuck by his head and or hair in this tree, and he can't get down. And one of the soldiers that is pursuing him sees this and comes and tells Joab. And Joab asks him, why didn't you kill him? And the soldier says, I heard the king tell you, don't kill him, so I'm not going to kill him. And Joab says, I would have given you silver, 10 pieces of silver, and I would have given you a girdle or a belt. That probably means a promotion, like I would have made you an officer. I would have given you an official article of clothing. And the man says, I don't care if you would have given me 1,000 pieces of silver. I wouldn't have killed the king's son. And so then Joab says, I will not waste time like this with you. In the King James Version, I like it, it says, I may not tarry thus with thee. I'm not going to waste my time. And so he takes 3 javelins, that is Joab, in his hand, and thrusts them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. Then 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So Absalom's dead. The king is again not in battle. And so he is waiting to hear about how the battle is going. And in verse 33 of chapter 18 we read, and the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. As he went, he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. So Joab kills Absalom. David's not there. One of the men, one of the priest's sons that David sends back to Jerusalem and says, take the ark of God back to Jerusalem. If I find favor in God's sight, he's going to let me see it again. And then he says, and then you have 2 sons. I want you to use them to deliver messages to me. And they're the ones that find out what the plan is, and they're going to wait for the whole army. And these 2 sons, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, are the ones that run out and tell David. It is this same one of these priest's sons that is newly appointed a messenger to the king, sees his son die, and he turns to Joab and he says, let me run and bear the king tidings and tell him what has happened. And Joab says, no, you will not go bear the king's tidings. You are his friend. And he turns to another soldier that probably doesn't know David from anybody and sends him on. And then again, this young man asks Joab, he says, please let me go and bear tidings. And Joab says, you have no tidings to bear. What are you going to do? The news is already taken care of. And again, he asked Joab, please just let me run. So finally Joab can't tarry thus with him, can't waste his time with him. He says, fine, run on. And so he runs, and he runs so fast. He's so excited to be the messenger of the king. The king asked him directly, asked his father directly, to let me be the king's messenger. And he runs on. He runs so fast that he runs ahead of the guy that Joab had sent in the first place. And he gets to the king, And the king asks about the tidings, and he starts telling him. And the king kind of interrupts him and says, "But what of my son Absalom?" And man, you can just see when you're reading it, all of his confidence of his new role as the king's messenger runs away from him. And he says, "Oh yeah, there was a tumult, there was this thing going on, and you know what? I ran here to tell you before I even saw what happened. So who knows what happened to your son?" And King David probably knows that that's not true, because he says, "All right, just stand right here. We're going to wait for the next guy." And then the next guy comes in and tells him that his son's dead. And then we read this verse that we just read here. David's response. "And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate, and he weeps. And he said, 'O my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son.'" I think this is a good example of David having a heart after God's own heart. We think about what happens to us. We are here, creation and children of God. And we have turned our own position against him. And we, as a world, are now enemies of his. And God says, "Would that I could die for you instead of you die for me. Would that I could pay the consequence of your sin." David here, I believe, is not saying my son Absalom didn't deserve anything. He knows exactly what his son deserved. David doesn't have the authority or the autonomy that God does, certainly, so he couldn't actually do it. But just as we read in Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 8, "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved in his life, by his life." It is a great example of the heart of David being like the heart of God, that even though Absalom was his enemy, we can remember another time, even though Saul was his enemy, David is not out there seeking for his own glory, for his own victories in these battles. He wants to keep this kingdom together. And even though David had grown distant, even though there was a lot of fault that he had that we'll learn about, not next week because of Mission Sunday, but the 2 following weeks, some of the shortcomings of David in his kingship, he still has this heart where he goes back to God. And it's not just in prayer. It's not just in times when he sees that he fails, he returns and asks God. We even see here that his heart is similar. I really didn't think I was going to have any time for comments, but I have 2.5 minutes. Or I'm sorry, 2 minutes and 4 seconds. Maybe we don't have time to run mics, but if anybody has a quick question or comment, I can repeat it for those online. Or, Dave has a mic as well, if there's anything. Yeah, Larry?
David had forgiven Absalom in the beginning, and all of this would have been avoided.
Yeah, should David have forgiven Absalom in the beginning, and all of this could have been avoided? And Larry, I think this comes back to your moral authority comment from last week, that David had potentially lost his moral authority after the incident with Bathsheba. Because so many times it seems like we see that there's things David should have, and maybe in other times in his life would have done, but he doesn't do it in this time. And absolutely, I think that's a part of it. And maybe God just knew that he wouldn't, and that's partly why the curse is here. Lindsay.
I think we can have a love-hate relationship with David because of his pedestal being compared to as one that identifies with God's own heart. And I think that's the irony within us all as people who have chosen to follow Christ, is we can become the judge, but at the same time we are the sinner, and we have our limitations. And I love the grace that he shows, even because he really is powerless.
Yeah, and this time, even though he's the king, he finds himself powerless, and all of a sudden it's something that we can relate to. Yeah, it's great. What else? Yeah, April.
The deception of Joab, and David also was deceiving, because he wanted Bathsheba, and it was like, all
Yeah,
lie.
yeah.
And so they lied, and it came right back.
Yep, and the manipulation of Joab, I didn't think I'd have time, so I cut it out, but I think it's interesting. Maybe Joab just marked it, like, if I ever get an opportunity, Absalom, I'm going to kill you because you burned my field. I'm the only reason that you're here. I'm the one that had to convince the king to bring you back in the first place and deceive him to do it. But yeah, that's excellent. All right. Thank you guys very much.